Panel, in the context of the failed French intervention in the Sahel region and the very significant damage that terrorism that exists in that region is doing to China's incentives there, we think that it is absolutely vital as the CCP that you provide military assistance to the governments of those countries to stop the terrorism, but also to improve your image as China. A few points to note in setup. Firstly, on the nature of the Sahel region. We would note that the countries that comprise this region are largely post-colonial, they've been destabilised to an extent, and they are not very economically well off. We think that they have nascent economies and they would like to have as much self-determination and economic success as possible in light of their struggles to free themselves from colonialism in the past 50 or so years. And one of the things that is really important to them is international trade. However, they face an emerging threat of terror at the moment. We think that this is often in localised areas, maybe in the more rural parts of these countries, and we think that it causes economic harm to them in two ways. Firstly, directly through acts of terror that simply destroy shops and things like that, stop commerce from being able to occur. But secondly, and probably more importantly, because it indirectly affects their worthiness as trading partners, they're perceived as less stable and less good partners. We would also note that there was a French intervention in the Sahel very recently, and we think that this was a highly unsuccessful intervention. In some areas, it actually worsened the issue, and we think it was incredibly unpopular with the people in these countries. This is particularly important because it was perceived as deeply neo-colonial and exacerbated the tensions between these countries and France, which colonised them in the first place. This means that on our side, it is uniquely likely that we have a popular response to this terror act. Nothing that Ned can suggest is going to be as popular, because we would note that the people of these countries are not anti-intervention. Note that in the motion it says assistance. We think that assistance is provided consensually, but they received no tangible benefits from the French invasion, economic or strategic, and now they need assistance from someone else. Another point that we note in setup, and this is very important, we think that China has four main incentives. Firstly, they want to secure their economic assets in Africa. To the extent that terror threatens that, we think that they oppose it just purely pragmatically. Secondly, and more generally, they want to counterbalance the West with strategic alliances with countries that are not aligned with the West. We think this is particularly important to them. You can see their preference for that through the Belt and Road Initiative. Thirdly, we think that they want votes in the African Union. Note that this is extremely important. We think that even if these individual countries, and remember this for the entire debate, even if these individual countries are not economically profitable, we think it is extremely important to them that they have these African Union votes so that they can get the trade agreements that they would like. And fourthly, we think that they want positive domestic narratives about their success and how they are better than the West. So, why does this intervention meet China's aims in an international relations context? There are two parts to this point. Firstly, why these interventions are likely to succeed, and secondly, are the benefits that they provide. Firstly, on why these interventions are likely to succeed. We think that it's important to note firstly that these countries have military deficiencies at the moment that China is uniquely positioned to resolve. We think that they have, China has some of the best technology and some of the best military intelligence capacity in the world. They have a very significant army and reserves of resources. We think that that is really important. This adds to this creates an asymmetry where currently we think that there is probably quite a symmetrical level of ability to respond between terror groups and the governments of the Sahel individually. We think that China makes that an asymmetrical thing, which makes it likely that the intervention will succeed. Secondly, we think that they can leverage their incredibly strong military intelligence from other trading partners. We think that China does use surveillance to quite a significant extent, especially in countries in which it has assets. We think that this means that compared to the comparative, we are much more likely to get success. What the comparative looks like is on their side, the Sahel countries do not have any access to that intelligence. Maybe they share information between themselves, but they're unlikely to get information from other parts of Africa or from other parts of the world that China could get it from. Thirdly, we think that China is likely to do the economic development in these countries that actually gives them a long-term chance of reducing terror. We think that China firstly has a large number of people who would just have specialized in international relations, who would have studied it, who would have they would have strategists and people like that, but they also take a very materialist approach to a lot of things that they do. For example, they would understand that food aid reduces the likelihood of terror, and we think that they, even just because of their political philosophy, are likely to have more effective interventions in these countries. Fourthly, we think that China, it seems less aggravating than the West to these countries because of the perception that these nations would have of their intervention. We think that even if that is a marginal benefit, it is still good that it doesn't inflame the post-colonial issues within these countries, that they are not perceived as a colonising power. And fifthly, we think that this assistance, again, like I flagged, is likely to be consensual rather than something that is imposed and enforced, which is much more like the French intervention that we think Side Neg has to largely defend. Even if these interventions are not successful, note a couple of things here. Firstly, that China doesn't have to compete against a metric of like perfect intervention, because Western countries in their interventions have been largely extremely unsuccessful, and they have shown that this is very difficult, but also in that the most recent Western intervention by France was a complete failure. So China does not need to like be perfect. They just need to be a little bit better, or like at best neutral. Because secondly, China has a huge capacity to obfuscate any failures that they have. We think they can do this because they say this is for national security reasons. We think that they can like minimize any media attention that this gets, but also that these countries probably don't get a lot of international spotlight anyway. And we think that then there are also other independent benefits. What are those benefits? Firstly, we think that China benefits from the economic development these countries will experience. We think that they can leverage their assistance that they will provide to do things like, say, that assistance would be conditional on getting favourable terms in trading agreements. We think things like that are really in China's interests. Secondly, we think that they can conduct military surveillance, and we think that that will give them insights into the Sahel countries, and that China has a revealed preference for getting this information and intelligence. You can look at the time that they bugged the African Union negotiations. We think that that is really important to them. Even if they can prove that these countries are not economically beneficial for China to assist on their own, we think that it is worth it for the votes in the African Union. We think this is important because their development plans for Africa cross the whole continent, and they need the support of as many little blocs as possible. But thirdly, we think that these countries are developing. So China has a unique opportunity to get a first mover advantage on places like on other parts of the world like the West if they intervene. We think that that is instrumental in securing the most favourable trading options for them. We would note that China is extremely long-term in its actions. It does things like sign 99-year leases. We think that this is something that it's quite likely to do. But lastly, why is this so good for China's image? We think that at the moment, China is perceived as economically capable, but in a lot of ways, a bad faith actor, or at least not someone who can be like the saviour of the world in the way that America has positioned itself. We think that intervening in countries to stop terrorism uniquely improves their perception in a way that nothing else can, because terrorism is widely regarded as incredibly bad. Everyone understands genuinely just the fear and the threats that it causes, but we also think that this is going to be popular within these countries, and that any coverage of it is likely to like reflect that. We think that this is overall beneficial for China's we think that the uniquely non-polarizing nature of interventions based on terror is uniquely beneficial for China's perception, and that even to the extent that this is not the largest benefit in this debate, China's interests are much better secured when it is seen as a good actor by other countries. We think ultimately, because we are the side that secures China's economic interests, because we secure their strategic interests and help them get better votes in the African Union, because we stamp out this terrorism and secure and achieve the aims that the CCP likely has, we take this debate.
All right, thank you very much for that speech, and I now welcome the first negative speaker to open the negative case. Hear, hear.
Hello. France's intervention in Africa was completely useless. It was seen as neo-colonial, it was extraordinarily expensive, and Mali literally asked them to leave their country, and opposition sees all of this, and their failure to meaningfully differentiate China from these Western efforts is what loses them this debate. Three things. Number one, the massive political costs that this incurs. Number two, why these countries are literally useless allies. And number three, why this effort is doomed in the first place. Number one, I think there are four distinct political costs that China has to cop on the side of Affirmative. Number one, it betrays their own internal narratives in non-interventionism. Note that opposition sees that this idea of positive narratives and stuff, and like buying into this narrative is extraordinarily important in this debate. Because note that non-interventionism is a key principle behind Chinese nationalism. That is to say, it is the key differentiator between them and the neo-colonial West. That is included in every single press release ever. It has like been the narrative or the propaganda machine for decades. And the Chinese, that's why the Chinese population is so vitriolic against things like international interventionism, like things like the Iraq War. Note that something like this would be unprecedented. China doesn't have a single military operation anywhere else in the world right now. Two harms. Number one, there's less internal buy-in to this narrative. The popularity of the CCP is predicated on this narrative, and it's why a lot of Chinese people are willing to accept things like repression because they don't think that they're colonialists like the West. You just get more resistance from the Chinese population under affirmative. And number two, this narrative gets weaponized by the West. That is to say, the West says things in the UN like you have literally no defense of your image. You are colonialists just like us. Number two, you lose the support of developing nations. Developing nations are already extraordinarily concerned about the exploitation of China, but they're sympathetic to that anti-imperialist image. They say, oh, at least you're not the US, at least you're not the EU, or whatever. But now China loses the defense of that image. Why is that important? It's because it means that like countries, like developing nations, for example, in Southeast Asia, become much, much more skeptical of dealing with China. That's important because those Southeast Asian countries were super important at containing US presence in the Pacific. For example, Vietnam, Philippines, you get less cooperation at the point at which you are seen as neo-colonialist. The third distinct political cost is that you piss off African Union states, East Africa in particular. Okay, just a little bit of clarification about what these countries look like. Number one, all three countries in the info slide recently had coups, and they now have very recent military dictatorships. Number two, these countries have all been largely rejected by the East African trade bloc. That is to say that they literally just got yeeted out of this agreement because they were like, oh, you're super undemocratic and unstable. Number three, they've copped significant amounts of criticism from the African Union, e.g. Egypt, South Africa, and Nigeria, because of the fact that they're undemocratic and repressive, and so they get very, very little sway and influence. Well, no, now you piss off all of those countries, which are, by the way, so much more economically and politically valuable. And so that's the opportunity cost mechanism that we're going to run. Number one, these countries are far, far more stable. That is to say, they have not had literal coups in the last year. Number two, they are far more wealthier because they have more natural resources. That looks like things like oil in Nigeria, diamonds in South Africa, and gold in Ethiopia. And all of those countries are now going to be part of the BRI. That looks like things like South Africa having a port. And these are the countries that China really cares about building deep trade links with. But now they are extraordinarily concerned. Why? Number one, China is literally propping up military dictatorships that they criticize. Number two, they have conflict on their doorstep. Number three, these terrorist groups are likely to get displaced across borders into the countries like Nigeria, and so that's a reason why they really, really don't want escalation. And number four, these countries are extraordinarily concerned that they're going to have to be forced to get involved after escalation. These are all reasons why they really, really would not support China in doing this. For the same reasons why these countries are so opposed to French operations in Burkina Faso, for example. We know all of the harms of French operations, you literally just have to cop under affirmative because they never meaningfully differentiate why China is going to be a much better actor. Number four, you just get far, far more civilian opposition. Why? Number one, because the civilians of this country have seen the destruction of other imperialist nations, and they have literally just seen France and EU forces fucking up in their countries. So it's really, really unclear as to why they would just be like, yes, China, please come into our country and do more militarization, right? Now China is also seen as colonial. They never explain to us why they will not be. They never meaningfully differentiate China as an actor and France, and why civilians would see one as neo-colonial and one as not, at the point at which China is funding military operations in countries like Niger. They concede that civilians fucking hated French operations in their country. Why does that change meaningfully? We need a response. Secondly, you escalate a lot of the problems at the point at which you're funding these kinds of operations. Yes, ISIS is a problem and terrorism bad, we agree, but this makes it so much worse. That looks like things just like retaliation, and civilians get caught in the crossfire at the point at which operations escalate. For example, ISIS retaliates by doing things like taking villages hostage. All of this means is that you get zero goodwill among the population of these people. What are a couple things that they say here? Number one, China getting involved won't inflame tensions with the population. Why? This was literally not mechanized. The second thing to say is that they were like, this is consensual, so the people clearly want it. No, these are all recent military dictatorships. Why is there any democratic accountability? Why do the civilians have any voice in terms of what they want? And so all of this means is that civilian opposition just means that China going into the future has less ground in these countries. It means that these civilians are much less likely to cooperate with the kinds of operations that China is likely to have. Those are the four distinct political costs that you have to cop on the side affirmative. Now, number two, why are their benefits literally useless? Number one, these countries are conflict-ridden. That is to say that the investment is extraordinarily risky because these countries are unstable. So you are probably just going to be pumping millions of dollars into these places for literally nothing. Number two, they are geographically in the middle of nowhere. They are in the Sahel. They are not like particularly geographically important. They like to the extent that like most of the land is desert. And so geographically, you have much less value in these countries. Number three, they can be safely bypassed for the BRI. They are not going to be involved in the BRI. The African countries that China actually cares about are countries like Cameroon, Benin, and Nigeria and Morocco. So it's deeply unclear as to why these countries are now the ones that China really wants to cozy up to add to the BRI. And number four, they were like, yes, maybe you get some more intelligence like bugging. This seems to be quite a contradiction because they'd want to like be really nice to these governments. So the governments like really like have really good relationships with them. Bugging their country is probably not going to do that, so they're unlikely to do those kinds of things. Even if like maybe you get some utility out of these countries, why uniquely are they still going to be useless? Because they're military dictatorships. Number one, you have no idea if those governments are actually going to survive into the future, so you get none of the long-term investment benefits that they want to bring you. If like literally like the government of Niger gets overthrown next year, none of that long-term investment manifests. Number two, the West and also Africa, like the East African Economic Union, are going to put pressure onto these dictatorships. E.g., like, in the words of Eugene, they got yeeted out of the East African Economic Union. So all of those things mean that those benefits are not going to manifest. Also, they were like, yes, you get African Union votes. Number one, congrats, you get literally 3 votes in your best case scenario. And number two, to the extent that these countries got ousted out of the African Union and have no political influence over bigger countries like South Africa, it is unclear as to why that's a benefit. All of this is to suggest that China has no impetus to go into these countries. They cop the political cost for nothing. France was asked to leave Mali by Mali. We think that this is going to be similar under their side. Number three, it's a doomed effort. They were like, oh yeah, China has good technology. So did the US, so did France. They still didn't get anywhere. Number one, it's because ousting terrorists is extraordinarily difficult because you need things like, I don't know, I can't read that. For example, the simple intuition pump is like the US was in Afghanistan for 20 years and then just lost it after like a few weeks. It's extraordinarily difficult to launch counterterrorism efforts. Number two, guerrilla warfare happens. The actual fact is that a lot of these civilians in these countries actually kind of like ISIS because the alternative is your extraordinarily unstable repressive military government. But now, why is that important? It's because they're not going to cooperate with China, and you can't win over their support. Number one, you have no translators. Like Sahel has many languages of which you have literally no translators. Number two, China has limited access to these countries. Goods need to arrive by planes, which means that it's extraordinarily expensive to put things like tanks in these countries, and so they're going to be extraordinarily under-equipped. And number three, they have no experience. This is the first time they've had an international expeditionary force in recent history. All of that is to suggest that even if you buy any of their analysis about why this is going to be useful, it is simply a doomed effort, all for just the 4 political costs that I already suggested to you, very proud to negate.
Thank you very much for that speech, and I now welcome the second affirmative speaker to continue the affirmative case. Hear, hear.
Sorry guys, give me 1 second. Panel, we thought it was really interesting when Negative got up and tried to rip into us for not making meaningful distinctions between France and China, despite the 8 minutes of substantive material that Liv gives you that outlines those meaningful distinctions. But we thought it was even funnier when, after ripping into us for apparently not making those meaningful distinctions, they tried to compare the USA's failure in Afghanistan in terms of the power asymmetry that existed there to the power asymmetry that was much more likely to exist between the Chinese military force, which is one of the biggest, best funded, and most developed militaries in the world, in comparison to regional terrorist groups who, for the very reasons that they give you, do not have the same levels of funding, do not have the same levels of international influence because they are not seen as internationally conducive to any form of influence that might be helpful to the kind of actor that would maybe fund the Taliban, that would maybe fund another terrorist group. So by that very metric, it was unclear to us why they could ever claim that this was going to exacerbate the existing issues of terrorism. It was unclear to us why they could ever claim that this was not going to be successful at the point where that level of military power asymmetry existed. But even more importantly, panel, it was unclear to us why they could tell us that this was never consented to at the point where maybe these military, like terrorist groups, couldn't combat China, but were causing significant issues for these countries, which did have an active interest in combating terrorism domestically, which did have an active interest in increasing their international standing, but also which, for the very reasons that Neg gave you, had an interest in just being stable countries where people could live in peace and harmony to some extent, even if that was only because that was the best way for you to maintain the autocracy that Neg wanted to talk to you about so extensively. What am I going to do in this speech? First, a bit of pushback on this idea about the political cost that China is likely to incur, both domestically and internationally. Then on this idea of consent. Then just a quick whip on why our benefits are in fact extremely utile and why very little of the analysis that they give you at first really stands at the end of this debate. First of all, on political costs, what do they tell you? They tell you firstly that it betrays the internal narrative that China has about being like non-interventionist. We would note a few things. The first and major thing that we would note is that China also has a massive and currently very important internal narrative about combating terrorism and about being like a benevolent and good actor that is against forms of extremism, particularly when that extremism is viewed as religious. We would note that that narrative probably honestly overrides narratives about intervention, particularly at the point where China is known for being at the very least economically interventionist in other nations. We would not see why that narrative somehow has this tipping point that's like, no, we can't send some soldiers, we can't send some guns. We just didn't think that the internal Chinese population was really going to be swayed by that. Secondly, though, we would note the key factor of consent, which they very, very lightly push back on to be like maybe some people within these countries wouldn't consent to it. We would note that firstly, at the point where the government consents, that is probably enough for the Chinese population to believe that there was national consent. But secondly, we would note that at the point where these people did not have that level of control, then whether some people within the population cared about it in like a democratic instance probably wasn't viewed as particularly important, particularly given that within that population there is not a precedent of them having to give their democratic consent for the actions that their government engages in. Lastly, though, we would note that this was a program of assistance, and that at that point the idea that this was unprecedented and that you'd never tested your military didn't really stand, because you probably weren't launching a fully fledged invasion. You were probably sending some soldiers, you were probably sending some guns, you were probably sending some supplies. We thought that that was going to be successful because of the types of terrorist groups that we were talking about. We didn't think that that was going to be enough for people to be like, oh my god, no, we can't like invade countries. We weren't invading countries in this motion. Then they tell you kind of that you lose developing nations. I'm going to talk about like the perception of consent within the Sahel region, but also we would note that in terms of their material about like developing nations in Asia, developing nations in the Asia Pacific, we would note that first of all, there are other existing mechanisms that mean that these countries are either necessarily anti-China or pro-China and have probably already made those alignments. We did not think that this was going to be the tipping point for them. Then we tell you about the domestic benefits of soft power in terms of that internal narrative. What do we say here? One, we tell you that all of the economic benefits that Olivia outlines that probably accrue at the point where these interventions were successful because you had a massively better resourced, better trained, better fed military force against like probably small cells of terrorists who could wreak havoc in individual regions, in individual towns, but who probably couldn't do it to a widespread enough extent that this would require like a full-on military intervention, that you're probably likely to accrue all of those economic benefits. What else do you get domestically? You get super effective propaganda. Why was this? The first was that terrorism was already a manufactured concern for people within the Chinese population. That was because of domestic policies about
like religious extremism and terrorism. The second thing to say was that Western intervention was specifically hated, and that at the point at which this was presented as like the necessary thing to prevent full-on like Western invasion of these countries, that probably garnered a great deal of support. The third thing was that this gave you a unique and like very, very good opportunity to demonstrate your previously untested military capacity. We would note the use of like military marches, we would note the use of like gun shows within the Chinese propaganda machine already. We thought that this was probably a really, really good mechanism by which you could demonstrate that this worked against an opponent who was viewed as being like an absolute evil by your population. But the fourth, and probably the most important thing to note here that they never give you any mechanisms as to why it doesn't stand, is that the Chinese government had a unique capacity to propagandize and inflate their actions within these countries. They had a unique capacity to present them as being incredibly, incredibly successful. They had a unique capacity to present them as being an ultimate moral good. What were the impacts of that? The first was that you were able to continue manufacturing consent for this policy, but you were also able to continue manufacturing consent for other policies in the future that were also probably substantially beneficial to the Chinese foreign policy interest. We would note that that is incredibly necessary. We would note the presence of current propaganda machines. What's the last mech they give you? They talk about East Africa. They talk about how these countries are maybe not super popular. We would note firstly, it was absolutely unclear to us why this was the condition upon which like the African Union got mad at these countries. We would note that if these countries were already like, you know, perceived as bad, then it was unclear why this accrued a real harm to China. But also, it was unclear to us why this was in fact the tipping point. We would note that most of these countries were actively opposed specifically to Western colonialism because it was the evils of Western unconsensual colonialism that had subjected them to their condition in life in the first place. We would also note that many countries within the African Union, for example, Nigeria, face similar issues about terrorism. So at the point where you were able to say you will not have displaced terrorist groups because we will deal with them effectively, at the point where you were able to say that you could stop the trajectory of these terrorist groups, it was incredibly unlikely that any of those countries really viewed this as a massive problem. Why did we get consent in the Sahel? It was pretty simple. It was because assistance implied consent. We never hear a reason as to why these countries did not consent to this, apart from maybe it was neo-colonialism. They never substantiate it. Throw it away from your minds. The second was the personal way up that individuals within the Sahel were likely to have. Panel, if you're picking between starvation or having food distributed to you, soldiers who are pushing back against the terrorists in your region, and the young girls in your region being able to go to school for maybe one of the first like stable periods in recent history, we thought that the personal way up you probably made was to go with the Chinese soldiers who were going to give you those benefits. For those reasons, our benefits were incredibly utile because you could install a government you could control, you still had the voting power, you still had the consent, you still prevented that trajectory, and for all of those reasons we were incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech, and I now invite the second negative speaker to continue the negative case. Hear, hear.
Just double checking the mic. Does that work? Yep, awesome. Question 1 in this debate. Does side opposition stop terrorism or make it worse? They hinge their entire case upon this will be more successful than France, therefore we will get less animosity, less collateral damage, less civilian deaths. First, they don't respond to all our analysis about why this actually makes terrorism worse. First, it inflames terrorism because now ISIS has to react in self-defense and kill other people to defend itself. But second, that they have retaliatory campaigns. Once you bomb sets of ISIS camps, they now go out to villages to take revenge upon innocent people. No response. Second, we proved that actually this fuels anti-imperialism and drives recruitment for ISIS and other terrorist institutions. Because, who would have guessed it, once you get more military and foreign intervention in these countries, that really angers certain individuals and drives them to join these forms of institutions. Why? do they support ISIS even if they are terrorist and quite evil? First, because they just want to be able to control their lives. They want an autonomous state. They do not want to be a puppet of a foreign country. But second, they just want stability. They want their lives to move on and to be able to live. They do not particularly care what type of government governs over them. They just want to be able to move on with a life without violence. So they make all of that worse. They increase the strength of ISIS. But no, what is their response, therefore, that terrorism decreases? Their first response is that technology of China is better, which is first untrue, second uncomparative to France or the US, and finally unclear why technology matters in anti-terrorist campaigns. The second, they push out that we just get fight more troops than the West. Yes, China is one of the biggest armies, so what? Are you proposing to send millions of Chinese troops into the desert and hills and mountains of these West African nations? Totally and frankly implausible. But they give other analysis, like we have surveillance information, but they have surveillance over their own population. They don't have surveillance of Burkina Faso, yet alone ISIS camps within Burkina Faso. And fourth, they're just like, oh, but they have a nicer political philosophy, which is true, but that is why China currently gives sets of humanitarian aid. It currently tries to build goodwill with the populace of these nations. This is why, in fact, it is incredibly unlikely that they are deeply interested in engaging in this intervention. Finally, they're just like, we're not going to be seen as colonial. They give very little rationale as to why. There are three very intuitive reasons that you would be still seen as colonial. One, that you're a global superpower and you're ginormous. There is huge power imbalances that still exist here. Two, that is a military intervention. Troops are still troops. Foreigners are still foreigners. What's the difference? Finally, they just don't have the defense of it being a coalition interference. So when Norway sends like 6 troops along with France, and France has a multitude of European nations, that at least gives them the guise of it's not a single country being imperial here. It is an international collective effort with the support of the UN. But of course, China has none of that defense. Finally, why is it that we just overwhelmingly explain that like in Afghanistan, like almost any other form of counter-terrorist operation, this will be a disaster? First, because they engage in guerrilla warfare such that all of their troops and all of their technology and all of their guns are simply ineffective. Why? Because as we explained, there are hundreds of different ethnicities and languages across the Sahel. Very few of those individuals can even speak English as well as their own native language, yet alone Chinese and their own native language. I do not understand how the military integrates with the local populace and armies. Do not understand why they say they have experience when this would literally be one of the first Chinese military expeditions in decades. I do not understand how you get supplies into countries that do not have ports. You need to airdrop in literally every single piece of equipment into these countries. Do not understand why it is that you do not have sets of competing incentives with the EU and NATO to compete over, is this mercenary aligned with the West or is this mercenary group aligned with China? So at the end of this, they decide, look, let's cop out a bit. We're just sending in some guns. This was an incredible strategic misstep. Why? Because it means that it is incredibly insignificant to actually counteracting terrorism. But second, it is that you still cop all of the harms to your image. The West still weaponizes this and says China is now an imperialist state. Developing nations still have concerns about China is going to escalate in the future, do further grievances. So, the end of this, weigh their material on terrorism particularly low, because their chance due to all these mechanisms of actually ending fighting is particularly unlikely, but our probability for making this worse is far, far more probable. But even if they are magically successful, they still receive a set of harms that do not outweigh the miraculous benefit of stopping terrorism. Number one, you have internal problems of legitimacy within your own country. We give 2 big arguments here. First being that China could not care less about anti-terrorism activities in West Africa because they are just a set of foreigners, and because Chinese people, like many people in the West, are just to a degree racist. So countries that are miles away, why do you care about helping them particularly deeply? And their proposition is to say, oh, we can fiat in this occurs with popular support. No, you cannot fiat characterization in debates. You can fiat that China will do this, but you cannot say that the populace will be in support of this military intervention. Second, is that we argue that Chinese care deeply, deeply about non-intervention. That is because the backbone of Chinese nationalism, which I think we all agree Chinese propaganda leverages incredibly heavily and is the centerpiece of why China is legitimate as a state, is one of humiliation. That colonial nations have humiliated us and that they ought never intervene. That is why all the responses that come out at first are deeply uncomparative. But they say things like there are narratives of anti-terrorism, there are narratives of anti-religion. No, those exist only internally. China says, yes, we will handle our own terrorists within our country. That does not mean we will handle other people's terrorists. That is why they never decry international terrorist organizations. That is why why they do not decry highly religious states like Pakistan. Second is that you just cannot use your propaganda in so far as like you can spin everything. Like this is a military intervention. How is their propaganda so good that they can literally fabricate things out of thin air that nothing is happening here? But even if you don't believe that China has an internal legitimacy crisis, which is just a huge and far more immediate pressing concern for them, believe that the African Union and the very benefit of developing states is incredibly implausible under their side. Give a huge set of reasons to suggest that East African countries would deeply resent this claim because of displacement of terrorists, because this will lead to a bunch of refugees, because there are foreign troops now bordering your country and are fighting. All of this suggests that East African countries, which already did not like these military dictatorships being propped up, would increasingly resent China and be less willing to engage in BRI programs, for instance. But second, their push on the African Union is also still deeply uncomparative because China does not recognize many of these illegal governments. Of course, countries like South Africa or Ethiopia would be deeply concerned when China engages in propping up illegitimate military regimes which they have decried because they are scared of military coups within their own countries. So finally, at the opposition's best case, they literally get 3 votes. We tell you our best case is a tremendous chilling effect where a whole bunch of countries that are concerned about debt entrapment from China, which are concerned about the very bugging side opposition talks about, now do not have the defense of being at least China is not as interventionist as the US and the West. At least we feel safer with China. This is a tremendous image, damage to Chinese image. Finally, he explained that there is a set of international criticism here which is substantial. First is that they cannot hide that form of suffering that occurs in these countries. That is because they do not have the same international Bretton Woods institutions like the West. They cannot engage in coalitions in the same way. But second is they explain that counterterrorism is popular, which is untrue. First, it's contingent on you actually being successful in your counterterrorism operations. Otherwise, it's like Afghanistan, where the US population says this is miserable, costing us heaps of money, why are we there? But second, it is that polarization means that you only favor counterterrorism in your own country that is done by, for instance, Western powers. So you do not gain international goodwill. But finally, it is that developing nations in particular are highly anti-counterterrorism. Why? Because the narrative of supporting insurgencies, the narratives of foreign involvement involved in counterterrorism operations is one that scares them deeply. So we get worse international criticism, we get less favor and goodwill with developing nations, we get a less legitimate and stable Chinese state. For what benefit? Apparently because there are some votes here, deeply, deeply unclear.
All right, thank you very much for that speech, and I now welcome the third affirmative speaker to conclude the affirmative case. Hear, hear.
Panel, it was so deeply unclear at this point in the debate why the metric and the consideration that would make states like Ethiopia and in Western Africa turn away from China was autocracy and undemocratic actions, insofar as China had a precedent of being undemocratic. If it was true that those countries were going to be aggrieved on that basis, what was the metric of difference in this debate to the extent that China was already autocratic? What was the actual substantive harm that you proved to the extent that they already had those types of tenets? We don't think that you proved those things in a way that is substantial. We, however, on the comparative tell you that China has an incentive to secure its assets in Africa, even to the extent that in those countries that do not have established assets. We think that terrorism is something that can spread and is bad for geopolitical security. We think that all of those benefits still stand. Now, 3 issues in this debate. Firstly, on the question of the benefits that China derives, whether or not this was actually going to be utile, and then lastly, we'll talk about the internal issues and deriving consent from those citizens. on that first point about terrorism, let's just be very, very clear about what we actually meant when we tell you that China has a big military. It isn't to say that you send in everyone. It is like a weighing metric to say that the relative capacity of China to do this was greater, and therefore we actually didn't have to say that it was a big harm in this debate. We could just give them intelligence. We could give them food security. We could quell the factors that underpin and precipitate terrorism and radicalization. We could simply give them military intelligence. We could simply just give them assets and train them. We could do things that were not overtly interventionist in the way that colonialism had been. We could do things that differentiated ourselves in that way. But note that secondly, the nature of Africa, as I try to characterize it, was very, very erroneous, insofar as it isn't true that you just have isolated blocks with their own internal interests. Terrorism spreads, guys. At the point at which you have radicalized groups, at the point at which you have narratives and increasing cells, they have incentive to move to other countries and kind of co-opt the narratives of other groups that are also trying to rebel against their governments. We think that insofar as you are a state which has experienced a history of violence, a history of insurrections, a history of insurgencies trying to take power away from you, you have a huge incentive to be counter-terrorist. You have a huge incentive not to allow groups to establish power, to establish capital, to potentially empower and embolden other people that live in the fringes of your own country to attack you. Those were the interests that actually made sense. Their characterization of the interests of these countries was to be democratic didn't make sense. A couple of reasons for us to why. First of all, even if it did make sense, let's just note the fact that it wasn't comparative. Second of all, note the fact that they were uniquely anti-colonial, not just in a way that was anti-intervention and I'm not going to accept your aid, but in a way that was anti-liberal democracy narratives of I'm going to come in and be very pro-liberal democracy. It was unclear for us why a country that had been dispossessed and plundered by liberal democracy was going to be so fond of it to the extent that it was now going to push out other countries on that sole basis. We told you that was a very weird characterization of how this actually operated. But note that, okay, so at the end of that, just note the fact that under our side of the house, we have a more realistic conceptions of the interests of these actors. It was unclear for us why they just prioritize like democracy in that sense. Note the fact that the country that they give you in an example, Nigeria, had a huge issue of terrorism where young girls were literally taken and assaulted and had all of their rights stripped away from them. We think that the interest for those constituents, insofar as they are democratic, was probably more tied to things like terrorism, because terrorism was a real tangible threat, even to the extent that it was exaggerated in some circumstances in its harms. It spread very quickly. You had WhatsApp messages sending things like, oh, terrorist organizations are particularly bad. That does not operate in the same way for liberal democracies. You simply cannot win the debate on that metric. Next, on the question of like, what actually happens with these unions and these votes? What kind of benefits does China derive? Note the fact that, first of all, even so far as I tell you that, oh, the nature of these conflicts means it's not politically or economically utile for China to go in. A couple of things that we tell you that just don't get sufficient response. Note, firstly, the time horizon of China was uniquely long-termist. We tell you that they do things like 99-year leases, insofar as the fact that, like, this country was currently in conflict. It was unclear for us why China believed it would be invariably in conflict for 99 years. I don't believe there was a history of that ever in the universe, right? But the second thing to note was that oftentimes these terrorist organizations were sometimes just localized, or sometimes there was an emerging threat of that terrorist organization rising. And so far as it hadn't already like stopped the economic development to a sufficient amount, we think that China still had economic incentives to go in there. But note that thirdly, China had an incentive to secure its existing investments in Africa. And I think this is a really important part of the debate that I just want to get very, very clear about. Because if you are a terrorist organization, your goal many times is to go after assets that are integral to a country's like stability, integral to a country's ability to do things like transport and roads. Insofar as China had incentives in those countries and in proximate countries, we think there was a huge likelihood that China had an incentive now to go in to secure those things, insofar as they did not want those assets to be destroyed in a war. That was very, very important because we proved to you why China had the incentives, we proved to you why the nature of the conflict didn't mean that there was no political or economic utility to be derived. Actually, we had a huge capacity for help. Next, on the question of how is this actually perceived internationally? Is this going to be interventionist? And even if it is interventionist, does that actually matter, panel? Firstly, we told you it is not perceived as interventionist because the reason for why these countries were so anti-colonial wasn't just because of the fact that they didn't like intervention. It was a unique type of dispossession that occurred under countries like France, the unique type of no help that I was getting, but you were still ruling and taking everything from me. Under our side of the house, when we frame to you that China is cognizant of the factors that underpin terrorism, they know it's food insecurity, they know it's poverty, they have incentives to go in and do things that quell those factors. We do not think that is like the history of colonialism, because the history of colonialism was taking things out of those countries but putting things into those countries. It is unclear for us why those are the same thing. But even to the extent that it is true that this is like colonialism, I don't understand why the US having an additional narrative in addition to all the other like very maligning things it says about China, that China is interventionist, mattered in this debate whatsoever. The US literally just like drags China over the rails for being autocratic, for like refouling North Korean defectors to their death. They already say these things. It is unclear for us why that was a huge issue in this debate. Next on the question of terrorism, does this actually work? Firstly, they tell you this response like, now the terrorists will take revenge. Presumably this was just a reason to never fight terrorism. It was unclear for us why this was actually going to work for them, right? But even so, insofar as they take revenge, note the asymmetry now that you applied that was unique. We told you that in these countries, you likely had it so that like the capacity of these militaries were like commensurate to the insurrectionists, comparative to us now when we introduced China's military capacity, their ability for surveillance, which is derived from their leverage of other countries, their ability to go in and do things like unique, like economic intervention. But secondly, note that our intervention doesn't have to look bad. It doesn't have to look overt. It can be soft power things. It can be getting rid of it before it actually becomes a huge issue. It can be getting rid of the underlying factors that are like going to stop terrorist organizations on the fringes. We think that their characterization of like pulling in tanks just like by the million is so uncharitable in this debate. It failed to engage with the nuance of ways in which we told you were actually operated, and for that reason, they cannot win this debate. Next on the question of consent, they tell you people don't consent because they're under an autocracy. Insofar as you're under an autocracy, all of your rights have been abrogated. It is unclear as to why the winning metric in this debate was going to be consent. It was probably more likely that the winning metric was going to be, are you fed? Do you have aid? We were the side of the House that uniquely did those things when China went in for those reasons. The next question, though, on internal issues. Does China have like a non-interventionist aim? A couple of responses to this thing that China wants to be uniquely non-interventionist. Firstly, we think that foreign policy was not likely to be the single determinant factor of whether or not individuals dissented, particularly foreign policy about small fringe African nations about which we told you people weren't discussing regularly in international politics. But secondly, we tell you China has the capacity to reframe these actions as being particularly positive, to lean into it as them being like a good actor on the global stage. Thirdly, we tell you that they could just frame this as securing their economic assets as opposed to intervention. We don't think that is particularly true, that like this is going to be harmful for them and cause like dissent. That harm wasn't grounded in this debate. The harm, however, of not securing your assets, of allowing terrorist organizations to flourish respectively in the future and allow that trajectory to continue was real. The harm of not being able to go in first and establish connections with these countries when they were still nascent, when they still had a capacity for huge growth, was real. The benefits that we derived in this debate were so clear. All of their harms did not make any sense with the characterization. For those reasons, we were so proud in this debate.
Thank you very much for that speech, and I now invite the third negative speaker to conclude the debate. Hear, hear.
Oh, sleep down? All right. Can I be heard? Cool. I'll ask two questions in this speech. Firstly, is China's interest in the Sahel worth the political cost of intervention? Secondly, even if it's theoretically worth it, would intervention allow China to fulfill those interests? Let's start on the first question. And I firstly want to acknowledge third affirmative strategy of minimizing the benefit that they can claim by saying it's only about sending a bit more intelligence drones. Firstly, it totally knifes the scale of their benefit because adding a bit more food aid is not proportionate to the outcome of ending terrorism in this region. But secondly, and crucially, it does not even mitigate the harms that we tell you about, because you are still taking a side with a dictatorship that has been blacklisted by the East African Union, and you are still engaging militarily definitionally. So you just knifed yourself. But I'm going to be generous. Best case scenario, you successfully stamp out terrorism from this region. Why is securing Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger not worth it? 3 reasons. Firstly, because if China were to gain from the long-term economic development from this region, that is contingent on China having buy-in from people on the ground that they would not resist Chinese forces, or at least rebel against a government that is aligned with Chinese interests. But we tell you that you precisely lose that when you go to war, because the primary consequence of any instance of warfare is the mass, devastating loss of civilian life. And we give you 2 reasons unresponded to as to why that is precisely the case in this debate. The first is one that the affirmative team concedes, which is that China is a relatively large army dealing with fragmented terrorist forces who engage in asymmetric warfare. But what does asymmetric warfare mean? It means that ISIS does things like hiding in rural villages in order to draw out mass bombing in order to kill a lot of civilians, to turn the tide of civilians against the Chinese forces. But secondly, we tell you that this is a context when domestic populations are already hostile to foreign actors because of the legacy of colonialism that both sides wanted to talk about. Third Affirmative says, well, it's not colonialism because you're not dispossessing things, but I fail to understand why that's the meaningful differentiator when China is coming into your country, when China is funding militia groups that oppress you, that kill your neighbors. I do not think that that is the distinction that the average person living in these regions is likely to feel. It's damning that they do not give that a better response. So, you kill a lot of civilians, you turn the tide against them, which means you cannot engage in things like economic trade with them. So best case scenario, it's over for them. Secondly, there's no guarantee that the military dictatorships are stable in the long term, which is to say that all of these countries just had a coup like a year ago, you know? So in order for China to engage in the long term, which Sierra wants to talk about, it's unclear why those dictatorships will remain for China to have a meaningful ally. But thirdly, even if you got all of that, it's unclear why there's even great prospects for economic growth in the first place. We tell you a couple of things they don't respond to. Firstly, that these regions lack natural resources, and secondly, it's difficult to establish secondary and tertiary industries insofar as it's landlocked, so there's no ports, and secondly, it's arid, so you can't get any agriculture. But lastly, even if you don't believe any of that, at best, by winning over the governments of these three countries, you get 3 votes in the African Union. And I want to compare that against all of the harms that you lose. Firstly, you lose support of the African Union, and secondly, you lose the perception of being a non-imperialist, jeopardizing the rest of the BRI. Let's start with the African Union. They do not give me a reason to believe why you will win over the African Union. We tell you that there are 2 reasons for why you will jeopardize that. The first is that the East African Trading Bloc has a very strong opposition to dictatorships that govern Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And Third Affirmative misunderstands this argument. It's not that China is being tainted by associating with dictatorships generally, it's that China is being tainted by associating with these specific dictatorships. They have just been blacklisted by the East African Trading Bloc, and that is the harm there. And the reasons for that is that obviously they're democracies, they want to promote democracies. These dictatorships do things like, for instance, fostering criminal trade, which also impacts these nations. But the second thing that we tell you is that the East African Trading Bloc has a strong opposition to to oppose more military involvement, which exacerbates conflict. So this Affirmative team is right. They are concerned about the Sahel region, but they're concerned about escalating and inflaming conflict, which you necessarily do by having China, another military power, join the fray. What was the mechanisms for why you exacerbate terrorism? It was very, very simple. They never respond to it. The first is that when you have more soldiers that kill more terrorists, the terrorists do things like bring terrorists from the other countries because borders are necessarily porous, but they have the incentive to do so because now they can justify it as an act of self-defense. They are able to rally rural populations around their cause. And secondly, they use it, they have now an incentive to engage in things like vindictive attacks because that is now reasonable. So, you lose support at the African Union. Why is that a harm? Because these nations were far more wealthier. For instance, Nigeria had oil. Plenty of other countries have, for instance, gold and resources, which you naturally lock out. But even if those countries were themselves not valuable, you lock out access to the rest of the African continent. Because if you believe that these countries are wealthier, that means they have strong economic ties to the rest of the African continent. So losing the East African Trading Bloc means that you effectively lose the rest of the African continent. That jeopardizes the BRI initiative in this debate. But we also tell you that this jeopardizes China's stance of being an anti-imperialist broadly because it renegades on their stance of never engaging militarily. Second Affirmative is like, but where is the tipping point? Like, they're already economically intervening, but why not militarily? I think there's a big difference between giving a country a loan and then sending tanks and soldiers in to kill your own civilians, because one is giving someone money and the other is killing people. That's the tipping point. Okay, so then they're like, oh, and notably, their arguments purely mitigate this part of the benefit, doesn't deal with anything about the African Union, and I just think that, like, so yeah, and they're like, oh, well, it wouldn't be a big deal. I think that's frankly offensive. A lot of countries do care about this, particularly in Africa. This is a massive conflict. It's likely to get on the news. Everyone will know about this. This jeopardizes China's reputation. So, we conclusively won on that issue. But secondly, even if it's theoretically worth it, would intervention allow China to fulfill these interests? And I want to be very clear. these guys grossly overestimate the bar for success in this debate, because we tell you that this is a 50-something year conflict, right? And as they concede, France, when France did things like wipe out ISIS, they just came back and the radicals remobilized because of those porous borders. And what that means then is that either they support an indefinite long-term process, or they support an invasion that must be so overwhelmingly successful, so overwhelmingly devastating as to incur a massive loss of life. And notably, all of our analysis as to how this is in opposition to the internal narratives in China suggested that indefinite long-term presence does not have political capital, for the reason that it's counter to the internal narratives that China ought be staunchly non-interventionist. They're like, no, there's like a counter-narrative that China is also against terrorism. I'd like to ask the affirmative team, in what other region of the world is China engaging in anti-terrorist activities? The answer is none. Perhaps it's like, in Uruguay, but that's a domestic issue. It's one that does not involve other countries. A second negative explains to no response from third affirmative. Okay, so we tell you, so given that it's not likely to be an indefinite long-term response, which is also highly costly for China anyway, and grossly raises the bar for their benefit, we tell you it's likely to be a very, very devastating invasion. And if you believe my prior framing, which is that an invasion that kills a massive amount of people just means that the country resents you forever, which means that you are never able to engage with that people, that means that an invasion is possibly the worst thing you can do if you actually want to engage with these countries for those reasons we oppose.